Hi everyone, welcome to Flip Video 1.6. We're continuing our analysis of what it means to think like a geographer. And we're actually going to look at two separate lenses today because they're very interrelated and interconnected. We're going to be looking at regions and place, and regionalization in place. So let's start off with regions. One of the key tasks that geographers engage in is looking at what comprises a region. What makes one specific place unique from another? What binds a group of people in one place versus another? So let's start off with a very basic term of what a region is, and that's an area on Earth's surface marked by some degree of homogeneity. If you do not know what homogeneity is, please put that on the left-hand side of your notes, and we'll define it as sameness. In other words, a region is an area that has something in common. So it has something about that people, something about that area, something about that group, something about that physical landscape. Something is in common in some way that we could identify that specific area or that place as a region, different or distinct from another area or region. And just like if you look at that word, the TION, shun, TION implies that it's a process. Regionalization is the process of creating regions. In other words, figuring out what those places actually have in common. You and I are going to consistently engage in the process of regionalization throughout this year because we're looking at one place, what causes a place to be considered a region, and how does it interact with other regions? So those are two key terms to help us frame this task of what it means to think like a geographer. There are several ways that we create these regions for geographers. For example, looking at areas by location, which specific areas of the world are located close to one another can help us differentiate one location from another. Hold on, here comes the announcement.
All students should be in attention at this time. If you're seeing...
Okay, we're back. Secondly, when you create those when the regions can be defined by those locations or positioned on Earth's surface, and the boundaries in between the regions can be either both visible or invisible. So, for example, the Rio Grande River would be a visible boundary, or not really proposed, but the actual wall that is continuing to be built on the U.S. and Mexican border would be a visible boundary. Whereas the difference in between, say, the Middle East and Southeast Asia would be an invisible boundary. There's nothing necessarily specifically hold on, let me give myself a different example there. The boundary between Western Europe and Eastern Europe, there's the Ural mountain range, but there isn't necessarily a complete boundary in that way. So regions are both have visible boundaries and invisible boundaries. Regions can also be hierarchical, right? Meaning just that same concept of ranking. We go from very specific regions to very broad regions. For example, Capitol Hill could be a region, a neighborhood in D.C. If we make that more broad, we could say that Capitol Hill is part of northeastern D.C. That too is a region. We could make it even more broad, and we could say that D.C. is a component of the DMV. So you can see that there's a hierarchy to those regions, in this case based upon the size of the region. There specifically, though, are three types of regions. There's a formal region, a functional region, and a perceptual region. There's actually three separate names for that last one. No need to write this down necessarily because I'm going to keep them I'm going to now break each one of these down. A formal region is actually the one that's easiest. Even though it's hardest to define, it's the easiest to understand because a formal region is essentially what you walked into this classroom understanding a region to be, an area where people have something in common. So formal region is also known as a uniform or a homogeneous region that has visibility, so I mean you can see it, you can find it on a map, and it has measurable homogeneity. Measurable homogeneity, a certain amount of sameness that can be measured. For example, I have up here a map of 3 regions in Massachusetts, right? These are measurable. We can specifically note where the boundaries begin and end. Perhaps people in region A have a typical, something specific about that group versus region B versus region C. A better example here is in India. These are formal regions in India because we can measure where these languages are found. This is where this language family is found. And the orange there, the Dravidian language family, is found here. So formal regions, just consider the exact same thing you would have thought a region to be when you walked in the door to this classroom. There's an area where people have something in common that you can measure with them. The second type of region is called a functional region. The key difference between a formal region and a functional region is that the functional region has a node, a focal point or a node. And that's that the whole region is then organized around that focal point or a node. So every time if you're trying to distinguish between a formal or a functional region, I want you to ask yourself, is there a node? Is there something very specific, a point of origin from which that whole region is based upon? So for example, top right corner, so the interactions between the node and the surrounding area define the region. So here's the node, and here's the area surrounding it. That then becomes the region. So for example, in the top right-hand corner, these are functional regions based upon baseball teams. So the allegiance is the baseball teams. The node, of course, would then be the city where the baseball team actually is present. So for example, we have a Nationals region. This is the fan base. The node is DC, surrounding fan base, or creates the functional region. We got the Braves, we got Atlanta, and then the surrounding territory. So the node is the city, and the surrounding region, the functional, is created based upon the interactions between that node and the boundaries. The two terms I want to use here that are helpful to help better understand this are the node and the hinterland, right? For example, the hinterland is the surrounding area. The node is DC, the hinterland is everywhere around DC. Hinterland just means surrounding area. If you didn't know that, toss it on the left-hand side. Radio stations serve as functional regions. You have the specific point of origin and the entire area that is served. You can actually envision NPR is right down the street from us here. You got NPR, is that from that building, that's where the radio is being emitted, the signal is being emitted, and there's the area that's served from that node, right? This is, of course, not Washington, D.C., but that's just an example. Here'd be a radio station here from Cape Cod in Massachusetts. You got the node and the area that it serves, right? Other examples, newspaper delivery. You got a node from where the newspaper is created, and the area that it's delivered to, right? You can't necessarily get the Washington Post in the middle of Montana, right? There's typically a functional region associated with that. You can, but it's far more expensive. Another example, radio stations, newspaper delivery regions, schools can serve as a functional region. City rec centers would serve as a functional region. You got a node in the area that it's served. So formal and functional. Formal is just sort of a basic area, a region with homogeneity. Functional region is that region that's organized around a node. The last one, I'm going to add one more term in here as well, has three terms that mean the exact same thing: conceptual, vernacular, or perceptual regions. These are regions that are based upon your own individual perception of what a region is or what a region is not. So for example, if we had the South, when people say we're going to the South, right? There are a lot of different definitions of what the South is. Some people may consider DC part of the South. Some people don't. Some people consider, you can see here, extending all the way out to Texas. Some people don't, right? Those are all perceptual regions. If I asked you to name the top 15 places in the world the best places to travel, those are perceptual regions. That's your concept, your perception of where to go, not mine. Perceptual regions have fuzzy boundaries because where it begins and ends is just based on individual perception and individual interpretation. Whereas we have functional regions and formal regions, you have very defined boundaries. For example, in a radio station, you know when you're leaving that functional region's boundaries because the radio signal starts to go fuzzy, or it's more expensive to get that newspaper delivered, or you have to go to a different school because you're outside the bounds of that functional region. Whereas a perceptual or conceptual region, those boundaries are quite fuzzy. Here's an example of the perceptual regions again of the entire North America, right? These are just generalizations of here's where the West is, here's the Pacific, here's the Southwest, here's the Northwest. These are not true boundaries, these are conceptual boundaries. These are fuzzy boundaries based on individual people's interpretation. So that's for region. What makes a region a specific region or makes a region very homogeneous is very linked to another theme of geography called place. Okay? Because place is what makes a place a place. That sounds a very mundane and basic definition, but it's true. The uniqueness or sameness of a place is what place means. I know that's redundant because I'm using the term in the definition. So perhaps you could say this as the uniqueness or sameness of a location. Place, when you're studying place, geographers are looking at the associations between a specific area. How do people interact in this area? How does the economy interact in this area? What makes this individual place this place? So for example, here in DC, we would argue you could cite Chuck Brown, you could cite Mumbo Sauce, you could cite the Anacostia River. These are the Anacostia River being a physical example. We've got the cultural examples. The federal government, the presence of the federal government helps make DC DC. So if that's what makes Washington DC, it's a combination of our culture, it's a combination of our physical environment, as you see here. It's a combination of our economy. All of these different things create what we are called our sense of place. What makes an individual place this place? As I just mentioned, place is shaped by, you could put that on the left-hand side, place is shaped by, and then underneath that, culture. And on the right-hand side, which is, of course, our people's lifestyles, our values, our beliefs, we have a mosque down there in Abu Dhabi. We have a market up there in the top right from Italy. Our culture shapes what makes a specific place feel like this place. What do we believe? What do we practice? What do we value here? Our sense of place in America might be different than the sense, or is quite different than the sense of place in North Korea, and the way in which that more oppressive regime treats its people. That creates that invisible sense of what a place is like. Culturally, more specifically, our sense of place is shaped by what people care about, right? So if we're connecting this back to regions and we're going through the process of regionalization, where we make regions, then we're going to look at, well, what do people care about? What languages, ethnicity, religion, what makes this place in this region unique in that sense? What are our institutions? On the top right there, that's a Sikh. A Sikh, of course, Sikhism is a faith, and that's the Diwali, one of the holidays and the practices there. The bottom right, that's actually from DC, the Meridian Hill Park. We've got what do people actually create? What do people take care of? What kind of food do people eat? What kind of shelter or sort of architecture do they create? What do people do for fun? All of these things contribute to that sense of place. Speaking of that place and those regions, we create here different value, a hierarchy of those cultures. Speaking of different ways to organize culture and different sense of place, this is something I'm going to introduce you to now, but we'll revisit in Unit 3. You could actually we can use specific practices of groups of people to then go through that process of regionalization. In other words, we start with just cultural traits. What are the specific practices that people do? Then we look at, okay, what are the surrounding regions that do that? We go from a culture trait to a culture complex. And then we look up even further and we say, are there other cultures around here that similarly practice this? That becomes a culture system. And then all of a sudden, if we see there's enough commonalities between those culture systems, then we create what are known as culture realms. So in other words, we're looking for how those specific traits then ultimately build up to create that region. What this means in relation to sense of place is that the sense of place in an area that's a culture realm, like Anglo-America, is going to be a lot more similar to then perhaps the sense of place between sub-Saharan Africa and the Slavic region, North region here. Those culture traits and those culture systems and those culture realms ultimately are regions that are defined by what it feels like, what the practices are, what life is like in that given place. So we see this interplay and this connection between sense of place and how we define regions. Lastly, I mentioned this already, sense of place, and this is very, very similar to regions. So how do we define regions and how do we define our sense of place? Our sense of place can be influenced by the climate, right? By the physical, natural world. For example, climate, which is just the long-term average weather condition, what the weather is typically like is the climate in a given place, and those are our climate classifications that we'll get to when we get to agriculture. Vegetation, the kind of plants that are around us. So let me back myself up. The climate can contribute to the sense of place. For example, my very best friend lives in Chicago, and in Chicago, she's described that people tend to have very favorite neighborhood bars or neighborhood restaurants where people consistently hang out in, partly because it's so cold for so long. So people want to get up and out, but they have these common meeting spots, and that's a way in which the sense of place is influenced by the culture. The type of plant life, that doesn't just necessarily dictate the type of agriculture, but that's also just going to help contribute to what it feels like. Palm trees feel different than pine trees, right? Soil. The type of soil is going to contribute to the type of agriculture that can be practiced or cannot practiced, and that in turn contributes to a sense of place. Are we going to practice slash and burn farming, or is there going to be large-scale soybean cropping? All of that contributes to what makes a place feel like a place. And lastly, landforms. The surface of Earth's natural features. Are there mountains? Are there deserts? Are there plateaus? Are there meadows? Are there rivers? Are there lakes? Right? These are all different things that contribute to what makes this given place feel like a place, and in turn helps us regionalize as geographers. So that's it. There's the analysis questions for Flip Video 1.6. And for questions 2 through 4, I'd like specific descriptions of why DC could fit each one of those types of regions. All right, see you in class.